The Animal Holocaust, the extermination of 8 million horses in World War I. In 1934, the 20th anniversary of the outbreak of World War I was marked by a commemoration in London, England, honoring the heroes of the war. One of the notable figures present was Ragtime, a veteran who had served during the conflict. However, the tribute wasn't only for the human soldiers, but also for the horses that played a crucial role in the war effort. Throughout the war, over 8 million horses lost their lives due to crossfire, disease, exhaustion, and neglect. This is a dark aspect of the war that is rarely mentioned, but is essential to understanding the full scope of World War I. Horses played an essential role in the military logistics of the conflict. However, their sacrifice was immense, and their suffering often went unnoticed. At that time, there were no efficient means of transport as we have today. Horses not only carried supplies, food, and ammunition, but also served as a vital part of the cavalry units, which played a strategic role on the battlefield. Mobility, speed, and the ability to carry large amounts of material made horses indispensable in combat, even as technology began to advance. The use of horses in combat. From the outset of the war, horses were used for various purposes. On the Western Front, where the most bloody battles were fought between the Allied forces and the German Empire, horses were essential for transporting supplies, food, and ammunition. However, as the conflict progressed, the conditions of the terrain and the development of new technologies, such as tanks and airplanes, reduced the role of horses in direct combat. Despite this, their utility in logistical and transport tasks never disappeared. During the early years of the war, horses were used for cavalry charges, reconnaissance, and even carrying artillery pieces. Their ability to move quickly over rough terrain and provide mobility to the forces made them invaluable. However, as trench warfare became the dominant mode of combat, horses faced unimaginable hardships. They were subjected to the same horrors as the soldiers: constant bombardment, poor living conditions, lack of food and water, and exposure to disease. Despite the perilous conditions, horses were often left to carry on with their duties, their well-being largely ignored by the military authorities. The brutality of the front lines. The conditions on the front lines were brutal not only for the soldiers, but also for the horses. As the war progressed, the demand for horses grew. With supplies and ammunition needed for the continuous fighting, horses were pushed to their limits. The animals were forced to pull heavy carts of supplies through mud, trenches, and war-torn landscapes. The constant bombardment of artillery shells, machine gun fire, and the ever-present threat of poison gas made the front lines a dangerous place for both men and animals alike. In addition to the trauma of battle, horses had to endure the harsh living conditions of the front lines. Often, there was no shelter, no fresh water, and little food. Horses were frequently left without proper medical care, making them vulnerable to illness and injury. The high death toll of horses during the war was not just due to combat. Many succumbed to diseases such as equine fever, tetanus, and rabies, which spread rapidly in the unsanitary conditions. The mortality of horses. It is estimated that around 8 million horses perished during World War I, a staggering number that far exceeds the number of soldiers killed in action. While some horses were killed in battle, many others died from exhaustion, disease, or neglect. Horses were worked to the point of collapse, and once they were no longer deemed useful, they were often discarded, left to die in the trenches or behind the lines. The lack of veterinarians on the front lines and the overwhelming demands of war made it impossible to provide adequate care for the animals. As the war dragged on, the number of dead horses continued to rise. The soldiers had to deal not only with the death of their comrades, but also with the sight of the horses they relied upon for transportation and support being killed or dying in agony. The horses became symbols of the brutal and senseless destruction of war, their suffering largely ignored in the historical narrative. The mass extermination of horses. The sheer number of horses that died during World War I was so large that it was impossible to deal with the bodies in a humane way. In many areas, the dead horses were simply left to rot in the fields or were buried in mass graves. In some cases, entire fields were covered with the remains of the animals. The bodies were a breeding ground for disease, further contributing to the suffering and death of both human and animal alike. As the war continued, military authorities began to recognize the scale of the problem and sought ways to manage the growing number of dead horses. In some areas, large-scale exterminations of horses were carried out, as the animals were considered expendable. Horses that were injured or unable to perform their duties were often shot by soldiers or left to die from starvation and neglect. The fate of the horses was largely ignored by the governments and military leaders. who focused their attention on the human cost of the war. While soldiers received medals and recognition for their service, the horses were left without acknowledgement, their sacrifices forgotten in the wake of the human tragedy. The psychological impact on soldiers. For many soldiers, the bond with their horses was more than just a utilitarian relationship. Horses were companions, and for some soldiers, they were the only source of comfort in the horrors of war. Many soldiers formed deep emotional attachments to the animals they worked with, and the loss of a horse was often as devastating as the loss of a fellow soldier. In the midst of the chaos and violence, the horses provided soldiers with a sense of connection to life outside the battlefield. They were a reminder of home, a symbol of strength and endurance. The death of a horse was not only a tragedy for the animal, but also for the soldier who had relied on it for companionship and support. The emotional toll of the war was compounded by the constant exposure to the suffering and death of the horses. Soldiers often had to witness their horses being killed or dying from injuries and exhaustion. This caused immense psychological strain, and many soldiers were haunted by the images of the horses they had cared for and lost during the war. The legacy of the animal Holocaust. After the war, the horses that had served in the conflict were quickly forgotten. The victorious nations celebrated their human soldiers, but the animals that had given their lives for the war effort were left out of the narrative. The horses were treated as mere tools of war, their suffering and sacrifice overlooked in the aftermath of the conflict. It wasn't until 1923, when a monument was erected in London to honor the horses that had died in the war, that any formal recognition was given to these animals. The monument, known as the War Horse Memorial, was the first public acknowledgement of the horses' contributions. While this monument was a step toward honoring the animals, it was not enough to address the full extent of their suffering. In the years that followed, a few other memorials were erected in various countries to honor the horses that had died in the war. However, these efforts were often overshadowed by the broader focus on human casualties. The story of the horses' sacrifice remained largely unknown to the public, and their suffering continued to be neglected. Remembering the horses, a call for recognition. Today, the story of the horses that served in World War I remains largely untold. Their suffering and sacrifice are often overshadowed by the human tragedy of the war. However, there is a growing movement to recognize the role that animals played in the conflict and to ensure that their contributions are remembered. The lessons of the horse's plight are clear. War does not only devastate human lives but also leaves lasting scars on the animals that are caught in its wake. The story of the 8 million horses that died in World War I is a stark reminder of the brutality of war and the importance of recognizing the suffering of all living beings, human and animal alike. In recent years, there has been an increased effort to honor the memory of these horses through monuments, educational programs, and public awareness campaigns. These efforts seek to ensure that the horses' sacrifices are not forgotten, and that future generations understand the full extent of the war's impact on both humans and animals. As we reflect on the history of World War I, we must remember the horses that were sacrificed in the name of war. They were not just tools of war, they were living beings that suffered and died alongside the soldiers they served. The story of the horses is a reminder of the importance of compassion and respect for all creatures, regardless of their role in human conflicts.